story with you. It is not just my story, but it's a story of thousands of people in Israel that have been directly impacted by terror in the last intifada. And it's important for me to start off saying that, because when I speak, I'm not only speaking for myself, but I'm speaking for those 17 innocent people that didn't get to go home to their families that day. And so everything that I do is in their memory, and to make sure that they're not forgotten and that they have a voice. And that's really my feeling about everything I do since that day, is to give victims of terrorism a voice, to make sure that those that are not with us are not forgotten, and that those of us that live with the memories of what we experienced each and every day know that we have support and that we're not alone. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about myself, and then I'll explain to you how I got to Israel and what I was doing there. And then unfortunately what happened that day, which I always tell everybody is, while that day changed my life forever, there were some amazing things that happened that you wouldn't necessarily think, but they really taught me so much. And also to know that the people of Israel were there for me every step of the way, and how special for me it was to know that I had people there taking care of me just as if they were a part of my family. So I grew up in New Jersey, in a small town when I grew up, but now it's a lot larger, called Lakewood, New Jersey, if anyone has heard of it. And I grew up in a home that wasn't initially so Zionistic. I mean, we were involved in federation and things, and my father was and still is a New Jersey state senator. So I grew up very much involved in the community, and he's been there for over 30 years. And I was not really the child that loved the politics side of things, so I always shied away from it. And unfortunately, in this experience, I utilized that connection to really start the things that I've been doing over the last 17 years. So my story really begins on the morning of 9/11. I worked about 2 blocks away from the World Trade Center, and I lived in Manhattan. And on that morning, I overslept, and I was not able to see what the weather was outside. I had hit my alarm clock. I jumped out of bed. I realized I was running late. And when I put my hand out of the window in my bedroom, which was on the 14th floor, I realized that I couldn't tell what the weather was like below. So I turned on the television, and as I turned on the TV, I saw the towers burning. I immediately called my office, and the person that I spoke to said, "Don't bother coming down here. We're not sure what happened." The building shook and we're being evacuated. And I heard people screaming in the background. You could hear the chaos. And I realized on that day that we weren't really safe anywhere. It really impacted me greatly. I remember calling my parents, and my father said, "Don't come back to New Jersey. Stay where you are. Maybe something will happen on the bridge or in the tunnel. You're safer staying in your apartment." And I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. And I remember being glued to the news, and I had friends that came over that didn't want to be alone where they were, and so they stayed there. And I really didn't know what to do with everything that I was feeling. And I ended up, I think we went back to work probably about 3 or 4 weeks later. And I remember going downtown and getting off at Chambers Street, which was a subway stop about 12 or 13 blocks away from my office, because the subway station that I used, which was Rector, which was a block away from the World Trade Center, that subway stop had been completely, I guess, destroyed or unable to have anyone down there. So we had to get off about 12 or 13 blocks. And as I would walk downtown and get closer to my office, sort of near Wall Street, I would see tons of crowds of people for that first week that I was walking to the office, blocking the sidewalks, online for something. I didn't know what it was. So one day, I think it was like the third day, I tapped the person on the shoulder and I said, "I see you guys here every day online. What are you doing?" And they said, "Oh, we're here to take a picture where the World Trade Center used to stand." And I thought, people are still down here looking for their loved ones. You see tons of posters and pictures like plastered all over downtown of people that didn't come home that day. And people are still down there trying to find out what happened to their family members. And you're here taking pictures as if this is the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty. And it got me really upset. And that's really what moved me to take the next steps. And I ended up quitting my job. in December of 2001. And I led a birthright trip to Israel of 35 college students. And I went to Israel because I felt like if I was going to be anywhere in the world, that's where I wanted to be. And I went there and I decided that I wanted to volunteer with victims of terrorism. So I started for the first 10 months and I was working with a few different organizations there. In the bigger scheme of the amount of time that I was in Israel for the almost 3 years, I volunteered with the One Family Fund, the Kobe Mendel Foundation, and an organization that's no longer around called Kids for Kids. And this was an organization that used to just, even if a child didn't have a family member in a terrorist attack, they were still in Jerusalem feeling anxious or, some type of frustration from everything going on. And we would do arts and crafts projects with them and just help them with their anxiety from the stress of what was a weekly occurrence of attacks in Jerusalem. And I loved everything I was doing. People used to say to me, what do you miss about the United States? And I would say, well, I miss my family. But the truth is, everything that I was doing in Israel, I could have done in New York City as well. And as those 10 months were coming to an end and my money was running low, I decided to book a flight back to the United States to go home and figure out my next steps. And then a friend of mine approached me and said that one of the schools that she worked in was looking for a school administrator. Would I be interested in applying? And so I applied for the position. And a week before my flight, I ended up canceling that ticket. And I decided that if I wanted to stay in Israel, I really wanted to feel like I was living there and not just a tourist. And for those of you that have been to Israel, you might be familiar. I lived in Katamon in Jerusalem. It's a very Anglo area. I felt very comfortable there. I lived right down the block from the president's house and around the corner from the prime minister's residence. So there was definitely a lot of security around and there were lots of people there. And I definitely felt like I was in a safe place. I took 2 buses to work in the morning and 2 buses home. I took the number 13 from Katamon into town, and then I would switch to the number 11, which would take me into Harnof. And I really loved everything that I was doing. I would work from about 8 to 2 every day. And then I would continue volunteering with the organizations that I had started volunteering with. And I always felt like in Israel, and I don't know why this is, I still feel like that to this day. I always felt like I had more hours in the day than I do here. And what did that mean? Whatever I wanted to accomplish there, I always felt like I was doing much more than I ever did when I was living in New York. And I felt like the work that I was doing was really meaningful and that I was really connecting and impacting lives to really make a difference for people that had been directly impacted by terrorism. And I remember listening to their stories and hearing what they were saying and not understanding what they had been through, but knowing that if I was helping them just by listening or running a program or whatever we were doing, I just felt like we were making a difference in the lives of these people whose lives had been really turned upside down. And then on June 11th, 2003, I always say it's a day that changed my life forever in a lot of good ways that came, but also bad. And through every bad situation, there's always a lot of good. And so I'm going to start off and explain to you a little bit about that day and go into detail about the attack. And I always like to preface to any group that I speak to that what I'm sharing with you is not something that I want to scare anybody, but I hope it empowers you. And I hope it makes you realize and see all the good that's in the world amongst some evil. And that, the light always shines over the darkness, and that we need to be the light and we need to spread that light throughout the world. And I think that message is something I take with me, and especially at this time of year as we're approaching Rosh Hashanah, it's just to me really important to keep that focus and keep that in mind. So the morning of June 11th, I actually had meetings all over Jerusalem. The day before was the last day of classes for the students, so I had made sure to make my meetings when classes were over. And I had actually been planning on going back to the United States a week later because I was going to work over the summer in New Jersey because, as my brother liked to say so nicely, my salary was below poverty level for American standards living in Israel. But for me, it was okay at that time. I think I made about $1,100 a month. It paid my rent. It let me do things. I was able to go out with friends, but it definitely wasn't this amazing salary. And so I rarely took cabs in Jerusalem because I didn't always want to spend the money. But on this day, as gorgeous a day as it was, I didn't want to try and figure out the routes to take all the different buses to all my meetings. So I already had known ahead of time that I was going to be taking cabs everywhere. And in 2003, you couldn't necessarily use your credit card in a cab, so you had to have the cash on you to be able to pay the drivers. So I remember my first meeting of the day was in Har Chotzvim in the high-tech area. Then I had a few meetings in town near Ben Yehuda. My last meeting of the day was in Givat Shaul, which was right next to Har Nof. And usually at around 2 o'clock, I'm packing up from work to go home. On this day, my last meeting ended around 2 o'clock. And I remember the person I was with said to me, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I'm right near Har Nof, so I'm going to go into the office. I'm going to get some things done so that way I can make sure that I get things done before I leave and I don't need to worry about things over the summer. And then when I come back in September for the school year, everything will already be in order." And I remember him saying to me, "Why are you going back to work? You finished your day. There's no reason to go into the office." But of course, me being the person I am and wanting to get work done, I went back into the office for a few hours. And as I got to the office, I realized that I was meeting a friend for dinner in the German colony, which is right next to Katzmon. So it was about a 5-minute walk from my apartment. And I was meeting her at a place called Cafe Hillel. And I wasn't sure how to get to the German colony by bus from Har Nof because I had never done that before. So I reached out to her and I said to her, "What bus can I take to get you?" And she said, "Take the number 14 bus. You can catch it right after the Tachana Merkazit, right after the bus station. It'll take you right into Emek Raphaim near Cafe Hillel." So at around 4 o'clock, I began packing up my stuff and I went outside to catch the number 11 bus. And I remember taking the bus to the bus station, but I couldn't find the number 14 bus right away. It wasn't so easy to find. So it did take me a little while, but by the time I got to the bus stop, it was probably closer to about 5 p.m. And the bus stop was really crowded and it kept getting more and more crowded because the buses were running late. And I don't know if any of you know what it's like to be at a bus stop at the end of the day with Israelis who want to get home to their family and they're exhausted, but you start to get to this attitude and this like feeling of insavlanut, which, which is kind of no patience. And although I thought I was a patient person before that, I definitely fed into that and was getting a little antsy at the bus stop. And so I ended up saying to myself, "You know what? I have no more cash on me, but I am going to get a cab and I'll stop at an ATM right at the entrance of Emek Raphaim, one of the banks, and I'll just take out cash for the cab driver." And as I went to put my arm out to hail the cab, I saw the number 14 bus coming. And so I thought, okay, I have my chafshi, my bus pass. I might as well use that so I don't have to spend more money than I need to. And as I boarded the bus, I was on the phone with my friend letting her know where I was. And the bus was pretty crowded. As I said, it was rush hour and the buses were running late, which meant that more people were at the bus stops when they were coming. And I remember the bus being packed and there was not an empty seat on the bus. So I stood at the back door, which is really the middle of the bus. And as I stood there, I had just gotten off the phone with my friend as the bus started moving. And we made our way to the next bus stop, which was Machane Yehuda, the marketplace. And at this area, again, hundreds of people are waiting for different buses. And I remember as we pulled up, 2 seats opened up right in front of me and the last 2 seats in the front section. Now, normally on days like this, I probably wouldn't have sat down, but I was so tired that I felt like I needed to take a seat. And I would have usually taken the aisle seat so that if somebody had gotten on that was older with packages, I could get up and let them sit down. But for some reason, I don't know why, I moved in towards the window seat. And I remember the young girl who sat down next to me and her boyfriend was standing. And I will tell you that if I didn't take that window seat, I would not be here today. And I'm going to share with you all exactly what happened. And again, I want to just preface that what I'm sharing with you is not to make anyone afraid, but hopefully to empower you. And at this point, I am going to bring up a picture of the bus and just show you what the bus looked like after the attack, and then I'll go in and explain to you what happened. Sorry about that. Okay, so my attack took place at Davidka, at the area of Davidka, at the top of Yafo, right after Machane Yehuda. And when I sat down in the seat, I didn't see anything unusual. I really wasn't looking for anything unusual because there had been a ceasefire, a 10-day ceasefire with Hamas. So I wasn't anticipating that there might be any issue or any problem going on. And I remember that as we were leaving Machane Yehuda, I remember the bus driver closing the door and people were still trying to get on. It was really packed. And I didn't really look over because there was too many people to my left that were outside the seat standing. And as we started moving, at that time in that year, I had a cell phone that was very, very big, and I didn't want to hold on to it. So I bent down in my seat because my knapsack was on the floor. And I remember opening the knapsack, dropping my phone in the knapsack. And as I started looking down to close the knapsack, I felt a huge shockwave hit me. And I didn't think it was a terrorist attack. I thought that maybe we got into a bus accident or that somebody hit me in the face with something. But the last thing that I thought was that someone boarded that bus strapped with explosives to hurt and murder innocent people. And the only way to explain to you what that shockwave felt like, it's like two pieces of metal that hit so hard against each other and then vibrate back. That's what I remember my body and my face feeling like. And I remember trying to lift my hands up to my face from my knapsack, and they were being pulled down from the shockwave, and my body was being pulled back against the seat. And I was lucky that I was looking down at the time because instinctively my eyes shut, and the doctor said that it probably saved my sight. Because when the blast stopped, I couldn't open my left eye at all because something had hit it and it was already swollen shut. And my right eye, I could barely open just enough to see the roof of the bus had fallen in and the man's head in front of me, and he wasn't moving. And right after the blast, there's this moment of silence. And it's not the silence that you hear outside in the summertime when the crickets are out. It's literally the silence of death all around you. And it's a split second, but it felt like so much longer. And after that silence, my ears started ringing really loud and I started screaming. And luckily I was screaming because there was a man outside that heard me. And I found out later that this man was 3 blocks away from the attack. He heard something and he came running. Because in Israel, when something happens and they hear it, they run to the problems, not away from it. This guy didn't know what was going on. He just heard something and he knew that he had to run to help. And he ran towards the burning bus to help me, and he heard me. And it always reminds me of the visions that I saw on television on 9/11, where people were running from the towers to get to safety. Because here in America, we're taught that if there's a problem or if there's something going on, we as civilians need to get to safety and we need to let the first responders, the firemen, the police get in. But in Israel, it doesn't matter if you're the police or Magen David Adom, everybody comes running to help because you're a human being in need. And this is the essence of who we are as the Jewish people, that when something is happening, when there's something going on that's wrong, we have to go in and try and help. And I don't know, I know that this is something that happens elsewhere, but the special thing about people running and the people that took care of me as if they were my family, I don't know that I would have felt that anywhere else but in Israel. Because when that guy came towards the burning bus and heard me screaming, he said, "You have to get out." And I said, "I can't." And he said, "Put your foot up on the bar that's next to you." And I thought it was the window, but it was really this triangle that was at the bottom of the bus. And I don't know if you could see my cursor, but it was this area here that had been blown out from the impact of the blast. And he took me through that little hole there with another man and brought me to the side of the road where an old woman waited with me until I was put into the ambulance. She wasn't the police. She wasn't Magen David Adom. She, as if she was keeping me awake and asking me questions, as if she were a mother waiting for her child to get help. And in a time where I was burned and bleeding and the most traumatic thing I'd ever been through, at a time where I thought I had no family around, I really had family around me that I didn't even know existed. And for me, the experience was very, very quick. For some victims, it feels like forever until help is going to arrive. But I was immediately put into the ambulance and taken to Hadassah Hospital. They said it was lucky that I was screaming because a little while after I was put into the ambulance, a small fire broke out in the front section of the bus. And because some of the people were either no longer alive or unconscious, the fact that I was screaming was they could get me out quickly. When I arrived into Hadassah Hospital, it's very interesting that the victim becomes the first priority. So they're not allowed to show the victim's face on the news. The media was there. And about a week before the attack, I had gone shopping with a friend of mine, and I had bought a very distinct pair of shoes. And as I was being wheeled into the hospital on the gurney, she saw on television my shoes at the end of the gurney. And that's how my friends actually found out. She saw the picture on the television, realized that those were the shoes we had bought together, and then started notifying my friends and thinking that I was probably on the bus. And when I got into the hospital, I was assessed with my injuries. A doctor came in, Dr. Avi Rifkin, who happened to be the head of the trauma unit there, and he determined that I was what was called KAL, which is lightly injured. According to America standards, that wouldn't be lightly injured, but in Israel, KAL means that you're not missing a limb. I was told I was going to be the last of the seriously wounded to go into surgery that night. And while I was waiting, I told the doctors and the nurses I didn't want them to call my family, because I didn't want a stranger to tell my parents that I was okay, because no one in the hospital had seen what I looked like before. And so I wanted to wait until someone who I knew arrived that could let my parents know what was going on. In the meantime, while I'm waiting to go into surgery, before anyone I knew arrived, and the way it was set up at that time in 2003 in the emergency room was you were in a bed and there were curtains around you. So every bed was in a row with different curtains. And I couldn't really hear much because my ears were ringing. But this old Taimani woman came into where I was while I was by myself. And she said to me, my son was a soldier on the bus. He's a few curtains down. He was injured. And he remembered getting on the bus with an American girl who was talking in English. And he said to his mother, go check on her. Maybe she doesn't have any family. Maybe she's by herself. And I thought, here's an 18 or 19-year-old kid, doesn't know me, never had a conversation with me. He's injured himself and he's sending his mother to check in on me. Because this is the essence of who we are, that when something is wrong, it's just something about us as Jews that we need to make sure that others are okay. And this was a scenario for me for the next, I don't know how long the span was, because for me, time in the hospital really didn't seem what it was. But another man came in and said, my daughter was on the bus. She was seated behind the bus driver. She's in surgery right now. If I could do anything for you, I speak English. What can I do? Can I call your family? Can I get you anything? And I just, again, thought to myself, at this time where I was alone by myself, I really had this family around me that was taking care of me who I didn't even know. And some of these people, even after the fact, I didn't even get to thank, but I was so grateful that they checked in on me to make sure I was okay. And that evening before surgery, my boss had come, and then my friends started coming to the hospital. And a reporter came in from the Los Angeles Times and asked if they could ask a few questions. And as my mother liked to say so nicely, the one thing that didn't stop working after the attack was my mouth. And so I said, sure. And he asked me a few questions. And then my boss, who had been standing there, pulled him aside and said, by the way, her father is a New Jersey state senator. And my life sort of became an open book. And I learned a lot about myself that I didn't know before from the media. So don't always believe everything that you hear or that you read. But for me, from that point on, things got a little crazy, because I did go into surgery that night at around 11:30 p.m. I think I came out somewhere around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and waiting in the recovery room was a family friend who lived in Israel, who had heard about the attack that night around 10:30. They were on their way home from some sort of simcha, and they ended up calling her son, who was in the army, and her and her son came back to the hospital to check on me, so that way she could call my mother to let her know that I was okay after surgery. In the meantime, through all this, which I wasn't aware of, my father was on his way over with my brother to Israel. My mother's passport was expired, and they didn't have enough time to get a replacement. So my father, my brother came, and my father came the next morning around 9:30 to the hospital. Before he arrived at the hospital, and again, once that reporter came in from Los Angeles Times, the media sort of wanted to come in and had a field day with it. So the hospital put together a press conference where I ended up speaking to about 30 international television and radio stations. And I remember asking about the people that were on the bus with me, and everyone would say to me, just worry about yourself. You'll see them, but focus on your recovery. And 2 days later, I asked the nurse when my room was a little quiet to turn on the TV for me. And I saw the faces on the news of the people that I remembered from the bus stop. When I tell you that if I didn't take that window seat, I wouldn't be here today, it's because on that day, over 100 of us were injured and 17 innocent people were murdered, including everyone that was seated and standing around me. So the girl next to me who was seated didn't survive. Her boyfriend, who I had just found out on the news that day, they had gotten engaged, he didn't survive. The 2 rows in front of me, the 4 people there didn't survive. And they said that the terrorist was approximately 2 people standing away from where I was seated, most likely standing next to the boyfriend. And so I know that I was given a second chance and that my time wasn't up. And the question for me was not why did this happen to me, but what was I going to do going forward? And I'm going to share with you something that I think, especially at this time of year, when Rosh Hashanah is here, that something that I always keep with me that was said. A friend of mine who actually made Aliyah and lives in Israel now had called me from the States to talk after the attack. And we talked for a few minutes. And she had said to me, you know, I knew her for many, many years. And she said, Sarri, I think that you were spared and that the people that were around you were protecting you for all the good that you had done in the world, the kira, the involvement in all the different organizations of volunteer work. They were protecting you for what you had done. And I thought this was very interesting what she said to me, and it sort of puzzled me a little bit. And so when I was on the phone with my rabbi that day, who was also in the States, I said to him what she had told me. And he said to me, Sarri, that's not true. He said, you never survive for what you've done in the past. You survive for what you're going to do in the future. And I think that's something really important. And I keep that with me always, that everything I do, no matter what it is not only to make sure that I'm taking advantage of every opportunity in front of me, but also to make sure that I'm taking advantage of the second chance that I was given to do whatever I'm supposed to be doing in this world. And while technically that's the end of my story, for me, it's really just the beginning, because I realized at that point, especially after that press conference, that I was given an opportunity to be a voice for Israel. So when I came back to the United States to recuperate for the summer, I ended up speaking at a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. I spoke in front of community leaders in New York and New Jersey about how to protect our cities better from what I learned in Israel. And then September 3rd, I boarded a flight back to Israel to continue living there and hopefully doing some of the work that I was doing. Unfortunately for me, after 9 months of being in Israel and some things happening, I ended up having to come back to the States for some ongoing medical issues. And when I came back to the States, it was very, very surreal, because I really couldn't connect with other victims of terrorism. The 9/11 community, I wasn't a 9/11 survivor, so I couldn't really connect with the 9/11 community. So my parents really taught me that sometimes if you can't find what you're looking for, you try and create it yourself. And so a number of years ago, I founded a nonprofit called Strength to Strength, which brings together victims of terrorism from around the world, showing that terrorism isn't one country's problem, it's a world problem. And the idea behind this is that when I would speak at places in the United States and share my story, people would tell me that what I went through was not really terrorism. And I said, no, what I went through is no different than what happened in Paris or in London or in Brussels or in Madrid or in 9/11 or anywhere else in the world. And so my feeling is that terrorism is terrorism, and all the victims around the world have gone through something so similar. And the one thing that we can do to combat the hate that we've experienced and to be able to move forward our lives is to do it together. And so we've built this global community working with organizations on the ground in 14 different countries. We work with organizations in Northern Ireland, in the UK, in Spain, in France, in Algeria, in Israel, in Argentina, Colombia, Uganda, Kenya, Belgium. We work with an organization in Australia, and as well as we work with people here in the US, organizations in Oklahoma City, Boston Marathon survivors, And then various victims who didn't have support when they came back to the States, victims who survived Mumbai and the Kenya Westgate bombing that's coming up later this month. And the whole idea is that we are stronger together, and that the peer-to-peer support is key for victims and survivors and bereaved family members, as well as first responders, all those that are impacted by a terrorist attack. And I think for me, the most important thing is that I had no control over what happened to me that day, but I do have control over how I live my life going forward. And I want to make sure I live that life, showing love and kindness and showing the opposite of what that day was all about. And I do believe that I'm here for the work that I'm doing and to be able to help people. And most importantly, to make sure that those 17 people on my bus have a voice. There was one American who was on my bus that day who didn't survive. His name was Alan Beer. He was originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm very close to this family, and I feel very blessed. And I always say that through the worst experience in my life, the best thing that happened was that I've met all these incredible people all over the world that I consider part of my family. And we are always there for each other. Our organization, especially during this last 6 months of COVID, has had to alter some of our programming. We run weekend retreats, we run webinars for our victims, but especially during this time, we've done online virtual memorial commemorations for victims from Oklahoma City, the Boston Marathon, all the anniversaries that have come up, London bombings. And the idea is that we try and fill a need of whatever somebody might need within their community of survivors and bereaved family members. I feel very honored to be able to do the work that I'm doing, to be able to be a voice and to advocate for victims of terrorism, and just for people to know that they're not alone. And while some victims can't share their stories and can't talk about what happened, I definitely think that I am lucky that I have, I think everything comes from your background and who you are. And I've been very blessed that I have two very strong parents. My support system after the attack was tremendous between my friends and my family. And I believe that's what's gotten me through this and given me the strength to be able to do the things I'm doing. And if I can give that over to another person who's been through something similar and help them, I think that's why I'm still here. And I think that especially during this time of year, and this is usually the most difficult time of the year outside the anniversary date, because it's really a reflection, as the holidays come up between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where it's a lot of reflection of what's happened the past year and what's going to happen in the upcoming year. And I guess, as I sort of end this off and open it up for questions, I want to kind of give us this blessing that this upcoming year should be filled with lots of blessings and happiness and joy and good opportunities for us, because it definitely has been a trying number of months probably for all of us. But I also think that sometimes from these difficult situations, it reminds us of some of the most important things in life and how we need to reevaluate and reprioritize some of the things that we're doing to be able to understand the bigger picture. And I feel, again, very blessed to be able to share with all of you my story at this time of year, and to be able to be that voice for some of the people that didn't get to go home that day. And hopefully for you to realize that while we are still dealing with long-term, every victim deals with things differently. It's not a one size fits all. Everyone deals with different trials and tribulations in life, but it's the way we deal with it going forward that I think is the most important. And so our organization, Strength to Strength, is really there to help people to move forward, to be able to be peer-to-peer support for victims, and for people to know that they're not alone and there's a place they can go to if they need anything. And on that note, I just want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to share with you. And if there's any questions, I would really love to answer them.
Thank you, Sarri. So I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll allow 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll have the rabbi conclude. So first, are there any, Shmuel, looks like you raised your hand. Would you like to ask a question? No. Okay.
I was just clapping.
What's that, sorry?
He was clapping.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Well, I don't know why I'm saying thank you, but on behalf of Sarri, I'll say thank you. Do we have any questions? I know a couple people sent us earlier. Is anybody now would like to ask? Okay, so I have one that was actually sent to me today, which is an interesting question. That's not something I really would have even thought about, which is, how do you sort of make peace with I don't know how to phrase it. It was sort of a long question, but like, how do you make peace with what happened in terms of that you survived and others didn't? Do feel guilty. I mean, I know that obviously you've done tremendous. You didn't just survive. Like I said, you thrived and you made tremendous work. But do you ever feel a sense of guilt that you survived and others didn't?
So it's interesting. A lot of times there's different levels of survivor's guilt. And I've talked about this with many, many survivors that feel it. I have friends and people that are acquaintances that I've spoken to that were downtown on 9/11 and they weren't near the towers, but they feel this guilt that they didn't go there to help people. So it's a very interesting, definition of what is survivor's guilt. For me, I don't think I felt survivor's guilt until a number of years ago. It was probably about 4 or 5 years after the attack. I was in Cleveland visiting friends. Both my college roommates actually live in Cleveland. And I was there for a weekend and they had a neighbor over for a meal and they were explaining to the neighbor that I had survived this terrorist attack. The neighbor was very good friends with the Beer family in Cleveland, whose son and brother didn't survive that day. And she's like, you have to meet with them. And I said, well, I actually reached out to them about 2 years ago and they didn't want to talk to me. So I really don't, I didn't want to impose anything. She's like, no, I'm going to speak to them and I'm going to get you to meet them while you're here. Cause they only live a few blocks away. And she spoke to them and they said Sunday morning I could come over to meet them. And I will tell you that it was the first time in my life that I experienced survivor's guilt. I walked into the house and Alan's, at that time, I think she must have been 81 or 82-year-old mother was in a wheelchair sitting in the living room. And she had this big portrait. It was a picture of Alan, her son, wrapped around her arms. And I walked into the room and she said, Sarri, I'm so glad you're alive. And I just lost it right there because it was really hard to see this woman. You could see the pain. You could see that it hadn't gone away. And you could see the love and the pain that she had gone through in losing her son. And then she was telling me how grateful she was that I was here. I think that was the one time I really felt the survivor's guilt. I don't really focus on it too much because first of all, I feel like for me, I want to focus on helping people and focus on the positive things to move forward and in my own, recovery of this and not focus on what I couldn't do and what I couldn't control, which is what I said. I didn't have control over anything that day, but I do have control about what I do going forward. And an attack happens in an instant, but the impact does last a lifetime. And everyone's going to deal with it differently. As I said, it's not a one size fits all, but I want to focus on the good that I'm going to do going forward, not necessarily, what I could have done differently or the people that were there that I couldn't help or couldn't save. So I think that's really how I focus on it. But it is an interesting question. It is something that a lot of victims of terrorism, especially the survivors community, a lot of people do struggle with this survivor's guilt. And it's definitely something that's not easy and it's ongoing. And people could not feel it one day and then a year later they could feel it. A lot of the emotions around an attack can come up at different points during life. It could be you feel nothing at a 5-year anniversary, but then at a 10-year anniversary, you feel this, guilt. So it's really just very different and very individualized for each person.
Well, tell us about the perpetrator. It was who was this person? Did I assume they know?
So it was an 18-year-old kid. He had been recruited by Hamas. He was on the Palestinian soccer team, and he was the 8th kid that year that had been recruited to carry out an attack. I don't know too much about him. I actually, people are very surprised. I don't blame him. I don't have any hate towards him. I put the blame towards Hamas, which is the group that was responsible for the attack. They indoctrinated him, they radicalized and brainwashed this kid to make him think that what he was doing was something that was going to be justified and that there would be something good coming out of it. And to me, the ends didn't justify the means. All that did that day was to impact so many hundreds of people and hundreds of families.
Wow. Well, truly, Sarri, an incredible story, and obviously on behalf of the H. Thornhill community, we want to thank you. Before Rabbi Rothman concludes, perhaps just gives us an intro to the holidays. Can you remind people again how they can find more information about your organization, your website again?
Sure, it's stosglobal.org. That's S as in strength, T-O, S as in strength, global.org. And yeah, we really, we're an all volunteer driven organization. I have a full-time job. Everybody involved with us have full-time jobs, but this is my passion. And it's important for me that victims feel like they're getting the support. And if I can pay it forward and give towards other victims, both survivors and bereaved family members, the way I was taken care of in Israel, I think that's the best thing that could come out of this.
Wonderful. Well, certainly we applaud you and thank you again for joining us. And now I want to pass you to the other Rabbi Rothman.
All right. Thank you very much. I came in a couple of minutes late, literally a couple of minutes late, less than 5 minutes, and I was able to hear Sarri's talk. And it reminds me of a parable that I heard. How you have this commodity called coal, and coal is very common and very inexpensive. But when you put coal under a great amount of pressure, the end result is a diamond. It is something that is not only quite dear to people and quite expensive, but something that is extraordinarily beautiful and useful. And it kept coming to mind when I heard Sarri speak about what happened and what she did about it. Right? Many people, when we go under pressure, right, we are always afraid we're going to crack. We're not going to be able to do anything, and we'll end up sitting alone in the dark in our rooms for the rest of our lives, just commiserating over things that have happened to us. But here we have an example of somebody who was under extraordinary pressure, not only just physically, right, as she described, but as well emotionally and psychologically. And she rose to the occasion, and she used it to become a diamond. And here we have not only just an extraordinary story of an individual, but an individual who did something that we promote regularly in our shul, in our community, which is the idea is that when you come across a problem, when something you see happens, rather than running away from that problem, you try to fix that problem. And then one of the reasons that Hashem put us in the world facing this specific problem is because the person who's facing that problem, has the answer, and I just don't realize I do. And here we found an example of this young woman who didn't choose to be a hero. Right? In no way did she choose to be a hero, and probably doesn't consider herself one, but took the experiences of her life and made a piece of coal into a diamond, and has created an organization which has now helped other people who may not have just had the innate strength that Sarri does, and instead could use the assistance so that they can shine also, and that they can come forward. And I can't tell you how touched I am by what you said, and I want to encourage everyone to please take a look at the website and support such an organization, which is really a very important organization, and what they do, how they help people. And you can be assured that whenever they're helping someone, if those people didn't have help, their lives would be a lot less fruitful and happy than they are now that an organization like this can come and help people who have gone through such horrible experiences. But in this case, we have a horrible experience that produced a diamond. I want to thank you really for taking of your time and telling your story once again, which I'm sure you do so often, but with the idea that every one of us need to be inspired by it to not only do the same in our lives to try to help people, to take a look at the problems that we face and try to rise above them and become better people and help others with it. But specifically in this area, to help with such an institution and organization that goes out and helps people who are affected by terrorist attacks of all sorts. And certainly, I want to encourage everyone to participate in it and to follow up and to use this opportunity to inspire ourselves to see how even a difficult situation we can rise up above it and become shining examples of people who make a difference in the world, not and not despite it, but because of it, because we went through such things. And I want to commend Sarri on this, and certainly encourage everyone to continue to take this to heart, to apply it to our own lives, and to help her with her cause, which is really our cause as well. So I want to thank everyone very much for making this evening possible, everyone for joining with us, for our continuing with the types of programs and events that we stand for. And this is really one that is more than just a way for us to learn, but it's a way for us to grow. So thank you very much for joining us and giving us of your time.
Thank you all so much, really. This is very meaningful for me at this time of year. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
It's been our honor. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.